Have you ever wondered why we are forbidden to doubt the official construction dates of the greatest engineering structures of the 19th century? We have been taught to believe the fairy tale that bearded men in bast shoes, armed only with a pickaxe, a shovel, and enthusiasm, performing technical miracles which even today, with our lasers and satellite navigation, cause engineers a headache. We have been lied to our entire lives about technological progress. The history you were taught in school is not a chronicle of events, but a carefully edited script designed to conceal a simple and frightening fact. We live on the ruins of a more advanced civilization, whose achievements we are merely clumsily trying to exploit, passing them off as our own. And today, I will prove this to you with an example that literally pierces through the official chronology. The discussion will be about the Alps. More precisely, about the gigantic railway tunnels, which were supposedly bored in the mid-19th century. Take a look at the map of Europe. The Alps are a natural fortress, a giant stone ridge dividing nations. And suddenly, as if on command, in the middle of the 19th century, when the primary mode of transport was the horse, and lighting was gas or candlelight, humanity begins to massively dig into the granite mountains. We are told that the world's first great mountain tunnel, Mont Cenis, or as it is also called, the Frejus Tunnel, began construction in 1857. Ponder this date, 1857. The United States of America had not yet experienced its Civil War. In Russia, preparations were just being made to abolish serfdom. Medicine was at the level of bloodletting. And at this very time, engineers of the Kingdom of Sardinia and France decide to bore through 13 kilometers of solid granite and quartz. 13 kilometers. Without dynamite. Without electricity. Without jackhammers in the modern sense of the word. The official version states that work was carried out simultaneously from two sides. The Italians came from the south, the French from the north. And here begins the most interesting part, which makes the hair stand on end for anyone familiar with geodesy. We are told that the tunnel breakthrough occurred on December 25, 1870, and the axis deviation was, attention, less than 60 centimeters horizontally and less than 30 centimeters vertically. Do you understand what this means? This is jewel-like precision. Even today, using laser levels, gyrotheodolites, and GPS satellite navigation, engineers make errors. And we are offered to believe that in the middle of the 19th century, in complete darkness, illuminated only by oil lamps, people passed through 13 kilometers of mountain and met almost perfectly straight. But let's set aside geodesy and talk about physics and biology. What did they bore with? Historians claim that for the first few years, manual labor and black powder were used. Imagine a narrow adit, going deep into the mountain for kilometers. There is no ventilation. There are no electric pumps for air supply. You detonate black powder. A cloud of carbon monoxide and poisonous combustion products forms. In a confined space, this is instant death. How did the workers breathe? Official sources mumble something about hydraulic compressors powered by mountain rivers at the tunnel entrance. But the power of such installations at that time did not allow air to be pumped 5 to 6 kilometers deep into a narrow pipe. This is physically impossible considering pressure losses. Workers should have suffocated by the hundreds every day. But in the reports, we see only dry statistics of accidents, which appear suspiciously understated for such hellish labor. Let's move on. The volume of excavation. To bore a tunnel of such diameter for a double-track railway, millions of cubic meters of rock must be extracted. Granite. This is one of the hardest rocks on Earth. How was this rock removed? By horses? A horse in a poorly ventilated tunnel would die faster than a human. By handcarts. Imagine the logistics. Thousands of people with handcarts running back and forth over a distance of 5 kilometers. This would create such a bottleneck that construction would halt in the very first month. But we are told that the pace of excavation only increased. Allegedly, engineer Germain Sommeiller invented a pneumatic drilling machine specifically for this project. What a surprising coincidence. As soon as an impossible task arises, a miracle machine is immediately pulled out of the sleeve, whose blueprints raise more questions than answers. These machines were cumbersome, requiring a complex system of compressed air tubes that constantly burst. However, construction did not stop for a single day. Here lies the main lie. What if these machines were not invented for drilling, but were created for clearing? What if the Mont-Cenis tunnel was not bored in the 19th century, but dug out? Look at the portals of these tunnels. Even today, using laser levels, gyrotheodolites, and GPS satellite navigation, engineers make errors. And we are offered to believe that in the middle of the 19th century, in complete darkness, illuminated only by oil lamps, people passed through 13 kilometers of mountain and met almost perfectly straight. But let's set aside geodesy and talk about physics and biology. What did they bore with? Historians claim that for the first few years, manual labor and black powder were used. Imagine a narrow adit going deep into the mountain for kilometers. There is no ventilation. There are no electric pumps for air supply. You detonate black powder. A cloud of carbon monoxide and poisonous combustion products forms. In a confined space, this is instant death. How did the workers breathe? Official sources mumble something about hydraulic compressors powered by mountain rivers at the tunnel entrance. But the power of such installations at that time did not allow air to be pumped 5 to 6 kilometers deep into a narrow pipe. This is physically impossible considering pressure losses. Workers should have suffocated by the hundreds every day. But in the reports, we see only dry statistics of accidents, which appears suspiciously understated for such hellish labor. Let's move on. The volume of excavation. To bore a tunnel of such diameter for a double-track railway, millions of cubic meters of rock must be extracted. Granite. This is one of the hardest rocks on Earth. How was this rock removed? By horses? A horse in a poorly ventilated tunnel would die faster than a human. By handcarts? Imagine the logistics. Thousands of people with handcarts running back and forth over a distance of 5 kilometers. This would create such a bottleneck that construction would halt in the very first month. But we are told that the pace of excavation only increased. Allegedly, engineer Germain Sommeiller invented a pneumatic drilling machine specifically for this project. What a surprising coincidence. As soon as an impossible task arises, a miracle machine is immediately pulled out of the sleeve, whose blueprints raise more questions than answers. These machines were cumbersome, requiring a complex system of compressed air tubes that constantly burst. However, construction did not stop for a single day. Here lies the main lie. What if these machines were not invented for drilling, but were created for clearing? What if the Mont-Cenis tunnel was not bored in the 19th century, but dug out? Look at the portals of these tunnels. These are monumental structures, made in antique style, with columns, battlements, and complex masonry. Why such pomp for an ordinary hole in a mountain, intended for steam locomotives that would blacken this beauty in a week? 19th century builders were pragmatists. They built factories of red brick, functional and cheap. And here we see the entrance to a temple. Perhaps this was an entrance to something else? into a transport artery of a civilization that existed long before us and possessed technologies allowing them to cut granite like butter. Look at old photographs from the construction. Do you see thousands of workers there? Do you see mountains, specifically mountains of excavated rock at the entrances? Where are these spoil heaps? Where did millions of tons of stone go? Usually, new mountains of rubble grow next to such construction sites. But in engravings and rare photos, we see only neat platforms and small piles of stones. This is not construction from scratch. This is major renovation. We came to something already built, found buried entrances, applied primitive technologies to clear the blockages, and called it the greatest achievement of 19th century engineering thought. But if they simply dug out this tunnel, then who actually built it? And where did those disappear who could melt stone and lay roads through the heart of mountains? The answer to this question is even more frightening than the lie about the construction itself, because it leads us to the understanding that humanity is not developing, but degrading after some global catastrophe. Let's delve into details that historians carefully avoid, preferring to feed us romantic tales of heroic labor. Let's move on to the next impossible object, the Gotthard Tunnel. This structure is even more grandiose than Mont Cenis. 15 kilometers through the heart of the Swiss Alps. Official construction dates, from 1872 to 1882. 10 years. Ponder these figures. They had to advance, on average, 4.5 meters per day. 4.5 meters of granite, gneiss, and quartz every single day for 10 years, without weekends or holidays. And this, despite the fact that the technology of that time, even according to the most optimistic descriptions in encyclopedias, often broke down, got stuck, and required constant maintenance. But the speed of excavation is just the tip of the iceberg of lies. Let's talk about temperature. Any geologist will tell you that as you go deeper into the Earth's interior, the temperature rises. The geothermal gradient in the Alps is very high. In the middle of the Gotthard Tunnel, beneath a mountain mass almost 2 kilometers thick, the rock temperature reached 30 to 40 degrees Celsius. Add to this the high humidity from underground springs that constantly flooded the workings. Add the heat generated by the decomposition of black powder or even dynamite, which was only just beginning to be used. Under such conditions, a person cannot physically work for more than 15 minutes. This is a bathhouse, a sauna, where one needs to swing a sledgehammer or operate a heavy drill. Official reports mention that workers worked semi-naked, but this does not save one from heat stroke in 100% humidity and the absence of normal air circulation. The ventilation, supposedly provided by pneumatic machines, physically could not cool a 15-kilometer pipe. This is a thermodynamic dead end. Either they had air conditioning systems that we do not know about, or the tunnel already existed and it was simply being cleared, without encountering rock heating from explosions and drilling. Now let's turn our attention to the logistics, which shatters the official version to smithereens. A tunnel is not just a hole in a rock. It is a complex engineering structure, whose walls and vaults are reinforced with stone masonry or brick. Look at the vaults of the Gotthard. They are lined with millions of bricks and dressed stones. Millions. Where did they come from? Where were brick factories of such productivity located in the high mountain wilderness of the 19th century? To deliver such a quantity of building materials to the tunnel entrance, continuous convoys of wagons would be needed. But along that same narrow road, a flow of excavated rock had to be moving in the opposite direction. Imagine this transport artery. Thousands of tons of granite moving outwards, millions of bricks moving inwards, and all of this on horses and mules, along mountain serpentines which are covered with snow in winter. This is a logistical collapse. No 19th century labor organization could have coped with such a flow of goods without modern machinery and wide highways. However, we are shown idyllic pictures where everything works like clockwork. Let's move on. Funding. Who paid for this banquet? The construction of the tunnels cost astronomical sums of money. It is officially believed that the project was financed by the joint stock company Gotthardbahn, in which Switzerland, Germany, and Italy invested. But let's recall the economic situation of those years. Europe had just experienced a series of wars, including the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. The economy was shaking with fever. The stock market crash of 1873 brought down markets. Where did states, exhausted by conflicts and crises, get hundreds of millions of francs in gold equivalent for a project whose profitability was highly questionable? Railways of that time were often unprofitable. Building a tunnel of such length for the sake of transporting coal and passengers is economic suicide. Unless the goal was entirely different. What if they were not building, but restoring a strategically important network left over from a past global civilization, and the costs were minimal compared to new construction? Pay attention to the figure of the main contractor, Louis Favre. This man won the tender, offering an unrealistically low price and an unrealistically short time frame. He staked his entire fortune. And what happened? He dies right in the tunnel a few years before the completion of construction. A heart attack. How convenient. The man who knew all the secrets of the real state of the object suddenly passes away, leaving no memoirs. His death is attributed to overwork. But perhaps he saw something he shouldn't have? Or was he removed so he wouldn't blab about his workers not boring through the mountain, but opening ancient sealed gates? Another fact that makes one ponder is the so-called tunnel disease. Thousands of workers suffered from anemia, weakness, and skin lesions. Doctors of that time blamed it on a parasite, hookworm. Allegedly, the tunnel had ideal conditions for the reproduction of worms. But the symptoms described in medical reports of those years surprisingly resemble radiation sickness or poisoning by unknown chemical reagents. Hair loss, ulcers, a catastrophic drop in immunity. What if, deep within the mountain, they stumbled upon the remnants of ancient technologies working on radioactive elements or mercury? What if they opened a burial ground of a past era and parasites are completely irrelevant here? Official medicine quickly found a convenient scapegoat in the form of a worm to close the question of mass deaths from an incomprehensible cause. And finally, the demographic question. Up to 5,000 people were allegedly involved in the construction of the Gotthard simultaneously. We are told that these were poor Italians. But allow me, the demography of 19th century Europe is full of blank spots. After the so-called Napoleonic Wars, which look more like a global territorial cleansing, there was a catastrophic lack of population. Cities stood half empty, as can be seen in photographs from the middle of the century. Where did this army of skilled masons and tunnelers come from? Working in a tunnel is not like plowing a field. Knowledge of shoring, explosives, and mechanics is needed. You cannot simply take a peasant, give him dynamite, and send him into the mountain. He would blow himself up and block the passage within the first hour. Where were these personnel trained? Where were the vocational schools of that time for thousands of miners? They are not in historical records. These people seemed to appear out of nowhere and vanished into nowhere after the completion of construction. We see a system that cracks at the seams with the slightest pressure of facts. The technical impossibility of ventilation and cooling, the logistical absurdity with brick delivery, Financial oddities in the midst of a crisis. Mysterious deaths of leaders and strange illnesses of workers. All this indicates that what we have before us is not the construction of the century, but a special operation to deconserve the object. The object was found, opened, cleared of dirt and deposits, and then presented to the public as an achievement of the progressive 19th century. But if this is so, then who built this megalithic pipeline initially? Whose trains were supposed to run on these perfect tracks, hidden under kilometers of granite? The answer to this question requires us to re-examine not only the history of technology, but also the very history of the human species. We are approaching the most grandiose and at the same time the most absurd object from the point of view of official history: the Simplon Tunnel. If Mont-Cenis and Gotthard still somehow try to fit within the bounds of human capabilities, then Simplon is an outright mockery of common sense. We are told that in 1898, the construction of a tunnel almost 20 kilometers long began. 20 kilometers under the Alpine ridge, where the height of the mountain massif overhead reaches 2,000 meters. But the most striking thing is not even the length. The most striking thing is the decision to build two parallel tunnels at once. The official version states that the second tunnel, of smaller diameter, was built for ventilation and as an exploratory adit. Ponder this nonsense. You are barely boring one hole in granite, losing people and equipment, and instead of concentrating all forces on it, you are simultaneously making a second one? This doubles costs, doubles time, doubles risks. No capitalist, counting every penny, would embark on such madness unless these two tunnels had always been there. Imagine the situation. You are excavating an ancient complex. You find two parallel pipes. One is better preserved, the other is more heavily blocked. You clear both, because it's easier to restore air circulation that way than to bore vertical shafts through 2 kilometers of rock, which is technically impossible anyway. It is the presence of two ready-made parallel tunnels that explains why engineers decided on such a strange configuration. They were not building. They were adapting what they found. During work in Simplon, workers encountered powerful sources of hot water. The water temperature reached 55 degrees Celsius. The flow gushed with a force of 500 liters per second. This is boiling water under pressure. In a confined space, this is an instant sauna where protein in the human body begins to coagulate. How did they stop this flow? Official history states that they used a system of pumps and bulkheads. In 1901, at a distance of 10 kilometers from the entrance. What pumps? Electricity was only just coming into use. Voltage was unstable, insulation primitive. In conditions of 100% humidity and high temperature, any electrical equipment of that time should have short-circuited within 5 minutes. Steam pumps? Hauling a steam boiler deep into a tunnel where there's already no air to breathe, and the temperature is almost 50 degrees. That's suicide. It's physically impossible. However, the water was stopped, and construction continued. The only reasonable explanation is that an ancient automatic drainage system, which the engineers accidentally activated or repaired, went into action. They were not fighting nature. They were interacting with a mechanism whose operating principle they only partially understood. Now let's look at what's inside. The quality of the finish. The walls of these tunnels are lined with stone with such geometric precision that it's impossible to slip a razor blade between the blocks. This is not rough masonry to reinforce the vault. This is polygonal masonry, which we see in ancient megalithic structures of Peru or Baalbek. Why such aesthetics and complexity in a dark railway tunnel? Why spend millions of man-hours on perfectly fitting granite blocks where no one will see it except a train driver speeding past in clouds of smoke? The answer is simple. It's not decoration. It's technology. The stone masonry functions as a waveguide or insulator. We use these tunnels for trains, but their original purpose could have been related to the transportation of energy or matter by other means. We are like savages who found a microscope and use it to crack nuts, marveling at how comfortably it fits in the hand. 19th century people were clearing cities buried under clay and soil up to their second floors. They were digging up railways that already connected continents. They were uncovering tunnels in the Alps that were part of a single planetary transport network. We call this the Industrial Revolution, but it would be more accurate to call it the Great Excavation. Look at the pace of railway construction at that time. Thousands of kilometers of tracks per year, tens of thousands of bridges, hundreds of tunnels, and all of this by hand, without heavy machinery? This is impossible from the perspective of logistics and resources. The only scenario where the numbers add up is if the tracks were already there. They only needed to be cleared of soil deposits, have rotten wooden sleepers replaced, and then primitive steam locomotives, created from found blueprints, could run on them. We revere 19th century technologies, considering them a breakthrough, whereas in reality, it was just the first timid step in mastering the legacy of giants. The alpine tunnels are the veins and arteries of a gigantic organism that we are trying to reanimate. But the most terrifying thing is that we don't know who killed this organism. We are using the infrastructure of a civilization that was destroyed by something so powerful that it reshaped the landscape of Europe, buried cities, and sealed mountain passes. And, apparently, those who now rule the world know the truth perfectly well. They know that the tunnels were not built. They know that we are merely tenants in someone else's house. And that is why official science so fiercely defends the myth of the pickaxe and shovel. Because if we admit that we did not build these tunnels, we will have to answer the question, what else around us does not belong to us? A question that overturns our entire understanding of reality. If these tunnels were not built in the 19th century, but merely dug out, then what happened to the world before that? Why was the planet's greatest transport network buried under millions of tons of soil, clay, and stone? We are approaching a topic that official science calls the cultural layer. But any sane person understands that this is a lie. The cultural layer grows at a rate of a few millimeters per year, and we see entire cities buried 5, 10, or even 20 meters deep. We see the first floors of buildings transformed into basements, with full-fledged windows and doors leading nowhere, into a dense wall of earth. And the Alps here are a key witness for the prosecution against the falsifiers of history. Look at the entrances to the Mont-Cenis and Simplon tunnels again. In old engravings and early daguerreotypes, it is visible that the surrounding area looks like it's been subjected to a bombardment or a monstrous mudslide. Chaos, piles of boulders, absence of vegetation. This is not a natural mountain landscape. This is a landscape after a catastrophe. The tunnels were plugged. Clogged with a clay plug formed as a result of the very event that wiped the previous civilization off the face of the earth. An event that alternative researchers call the mud flow, or the Great Flood of the 19th century. This is why engineers so confidently built from two sides at once and met with millimeter precision. They were not blindly going through rock. They were following an already existing corridor, clearing out deposits from it. The tunnel breakthrough was not the meeting of two excavation teams, but the moment when the last barrier of dirt separating an already finished pipe was removed. This explains everything, both the hellish heat and the strange illness of the workers, and the incredible pace. They were simply clearing debris. But the realization of this fact leads us to emotional shock. We live on ruins. Our entire 19th and 20th century civilization is a civilization of looters. We arrived at the ashes, put on someone else's clothes, occupied surviving stone houses that we don't know how to build, and appropriated the achievements of those who lived here before us. Railways are not Stevenson's invention. They are the circulatory system of a past world that we were allowed to partially restore. Pay attention to the track gauge. 1,435 millimeters. This is the so-called European gauge, or Stevenson gauge. We are told that this is the width of a Roman chariot axle. Seriously? You are building high-tech transport of the future, steam locomotives, wagons, and tying the standard of an entire industry to the rear end of a Roman horse? This is absurd. This figure is the standard of an ancient, unified energy network that we simply could not change because the tracks were already laid. We had to adapt our primitive steam locomotives to the rails of the gods. Feel this dissonance. A puffing, smoking, primitive steam locomotive, essentially a samovar on wheels, with an efficiency of less than 5%, travels along a perfectly straight, engineer-perfect tunnel, lined with granite with polygonal masonry. This looks as if savages harnessed a horse to a Boeing and dragged it along the runway, proudly claiming they invented aviation. We are these savages. We use infrastructure whose true purpose we don't even understand. Perhaps these tunnels were not intended for wheeled transport. Perhaps they were waveguides, parts of atmospheric electricity systems, or vacuum conduits for instantaneous movement. And we, having found this pipe, decided to run our coal carts through it. And here we come to the most cynical deception. We are told about progress, about how we went from a splinter lamp to an electric light bulb. But the facts cry out otherwise. We have degraded. The stone processing technologies we see in the Simplon and Gotthard tunnels are lost today. We cannot build like this from granite without the use of computer-controlled diamond cutters, and we are told that illiterate peasants with chisels did this. This is a slap in the face to our common sense. We are forced to believe that our ancestors were titans of strength and endurance, but idiots in terms of organization, willing to die by the thousands for a hole in a mountain. In reality, it's the opposite. Those who created this possessed knowledge beyond our wildest dreams, and we are merely service personnel who were allowed access to the control panel after a global reset. Imagine the scale of the tragedy. There was a civilization, unified, global, without borders or customs. It cut through mountains, connected continents, used free energy. And at one moment, all of it collapsed. Cities were covered by a wave of mud, mountains crumbled, sealing off main routes. The survivors became feral, lost technologies, forgot language. And a couple of hundred years later, when the dust settled, new masters of life appeared. They began to excavate the ruins, restore what could be restored, and rewrite history to suit themselves. They named the found technologies their own inventions. They invented hero engineers to explain the inexplicable. They created a myth of progress to conceal the fact of catastrophe. We are children, playing with a grenade found in our grandfather's chest. And the fuse is already lit. All official history is merely a screen behind which the fact of our defeat is hidden. We are not developing. We are trying to survive on the wreckage. And those who know the truth do everything to ensure we never raise our heads and look at the vaults of these tunnels with an informed gaze. Because if we understand that stone can be melted like plasticine, and mountains can be cut like butter, we will cease to be obedient slaves of a system that consumes oil and gas. We will demand our heritage back. And that is what they fear most of all.